this weekend we have the big rematch between Liam Smith and Chris Eubank Jr. Now, long-time subscribers and watchers of my videos will know that I'm generally not the biggest fan of immediate rematches unless there is a sufficient amount of intrigue or there is a good rationale for a rematch to happen immediately. Um, and this fight, I must say, for me, there is enough intrigue surrounding this. And a lot of that intrigue surrounds how will Eubank Jr. deal with the circumstances? Because of course, we just cast our minds back to January. He got completely cleaned out by Liam Smith in the fourth round. Like that was a brutal finish. And Eubank Jr. is a capable fighter. He is a decent fighter, but there have been large question marks surrounding him pretty much for the entirety of his career. And even though he does have ability, there's been a fair bit of smoke and mirrors, I think it's fair to say, whereby it's been difficult to gauge just how good Eubank Jr. is. Because against certain fighters of a certain level, he looks $1 million. And really, when he stepped up to the most meaningful fight, he's left quite a bit to be desired. That's just my opinion, but I think most people would agree. So there is a large psychological dynamic that is in play in this rematch. Of course, Eubank Jr. is having to deal with the demons and overcome them. Overcome the demons of being completely splattered by Liam Smith in the last fight. Because, yeah, fighters are incredibly tough relative to the average person or compared to the average person, but they are just human beings. And being stopped by an opponent in such brutal fashion, the kind of scarring that leaves, obviously physically, because there can be residual damage, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually, if you're that way inclined, it can cause a massive amount of turmoil within a fighter because they've been exposed. They've been, it's been proven that they're not invincible and that they are vulnerable, and someone can victimize them like that. So that is a very high pressure situation to deal with. And we're going to find out how does Eubank Jr. deal with that pressure. And then with Liam Smith, to a lesser degree, but there is still a psychological dynamic here, and that's going to be, can Smith keep away the complacency? Now, I know Liam Smith himself and Liam Smith's supporters will say, you know, complacency is not even part of the argument. Like, Smith is a consummate professional. We don't have to worry about this. Yeah, of course. Some fighters are like that. With Liam Smith, though, the way he dealt with Eubank Jr. in a grudge match, surely there's some degree of him thinking that he can just go in and do it again. And maybe he can, and it won't show itself to be a problem, but it's definitely going to be interesting to consider how Liam Smith goes into this fight knowing that he can deal with Eubank Jr. in a devastating fashion. And now, if we cast our minds back to the first fight, myself and many others said that Smith would be the best pressure fighter that Eubank Jr. has ever fought. And despite heaping that praise on Liam Smith, I still felt that Eubank Jr. would win. I just felt that stylistically over the course of his career, he is favoured fighting pressure fighters who have a relatively simple guard who look to come forward and press the action. Eubank Jr. tends to look good against those kind of guys. However, I think Liam Smith just proved that he was too much. I know there's a lot of kind of, oh, this went on behind the scenes and it's because of this why Eubank Jr. didn't look great. And maybe that does play a role, but personally, when I watched that first fight, the first fight between these two, I just saw Liam Smith being the more experienced guy, the more skilled guy, and the guy who just had a better understanding of how boxing works, in a sense. Eubank Jr., he is a capable fighter, but I described his skill set as being situational. Once again, going back to how he deals with pressure fighters. And even then, with his impressive situational skill set, Liam Smith was just too much. And now, you know, you've got to give Eubank credit because he did start to warm into the fight a bit more. He started to get some offense off, and his jab had a decent amount of success throughout the course of the fight. However, I haven't seen many people give Smith credit for the success that he had throughout the course of the fight, because he wasn't just looking to close the distance. He was feinting Eubank very effectively, seeing how Eubank Jr. would react to Smith looking to close the distance down. And when Smith saw that Eubank Jr. usually just reacts with a jab, he started timing Eubank Jr. over the top. And sometimes Eubank Jr. was just able to kind of get out of range, just peel away from that shot. But there were times where Smith would time Eubank Jr. with a beautiful right hand. It wasn't the hardest shot, but it was early on. And, you know, we have these old adages in boxing, like when in doubt, throw a jab. That first fight showed that it's not as simple to just throw a jab out and have success and keep a guy off. You've got a guy like Smith who knows his way around it. Someone who's been a pressure fighter for as long as I've watched him. And that's kind of his approach, is how can he get past your offense? How can he get past your reactions and start to get his offense off? And one thing as well, talking about Eubank Jr., his skill set, very situational, likes his pressure fighters. He's generally been kind of a physical guy. Even when he's on the back foot, Eubank Jr., he knows how to tie someone, he knows how to wrestle on the inside, and his offense is actually pretty good on the inside. But it really stood out to me how strong Smith was in comparison. For the first time in Eubank Jr.'s career, probably since the George Groves fight, Eubank Jr. didn't look like the stronger man. For my money, Liam Smith looked like an absolute bull compared to him and just bullied him around. And maybe Eubank Jr. wasn't taking it too seriously. Maybe he didn't want to expend too much energy in the clinches and so on. But it was quite alarming in my head how easily Smith was just able to close Eubank Jr. down, push him back to the ropes in the clinches. And Smith overall just looked really sturdy, really well preserved, because Smith's had a long career. I think he's 35 now as well, so he's a bit long in the tooth, but he looked really solid, really strong in there. Whereas Eubank Jr., I don't know, he was warming into the fight, but he just looked a little bit flat for my money. And there are factors at play that I think are the reason behind that. For example, for some reason he decided to carry on making weight after the Conor Benn fight fell through in October, and looked terrible. Like, yeah, he was cut to shreds and just peeled to the bone, but didn't look healthy at all. He looked emaciated. And obviously 2-3 months later, whatever it was, he's then in the ring with Smith, who looked like a bull in a china shop. So I definitely don't think that helped, but there was something about Eubank Jr. that was just a little bit off. He looked a little bit flat. Maybe it was getting into his groove, but yeah, you can get into your groove, but if there was someone like Smith who in that fight looked very good, very energized and very strong, could go belly up, and that's exactly what happened. Overall, if you want to talk tactically, I think that Junior's approach in the first fight was mostly correct. The way he was, yes, moving around using lateral movement, but every now and then he'd kind of stand his ground, conserve some energy, look to get off some of his own offense and draw a bit of a line in the sand. However, it did get to that fourth round whereby he just lingered for too long in the corner. And sometimes it's simple errors like that do really cost a fighter the W. Although I do believe that Smith was getting closer to Eubank Jr. I think it was a mostly even fight. Both guys had their moments. And yeah, it got to the fourth round, and Eubank Jr., I feel like he tried to use some of his slipperiness to deal with Liam Smith, but ultimately Liam Smith was just that good a pressure fighter, the kind of caliber of pressure fighter that Eubank Jr. hadn't dealt with before. And there were some red flags, two in particular, and one of them has actually been a staple of Eubank Jr.'s kind of approach to boxing, and that's this over-reliance on his chin. Now, this was something that always made me cringe because, yeah, Eubank Jr., I think he does have a degree of toughness, but there was always this kind of speculation that, oh, Eubank Jr. has always been really tough in sparring, and, you know, if you look at his dad had an amazing chin, very tough, and he's just inherited that. That always really made me cringe, and I mentioned this in the post-fight video for the first fight. I hated that because you you can't just make the assumption that, oh, your dad or my dad has a very tough chin and is as tough as old boot, and I'm just gonna inherit that. And so, not that Eubank Jr. is the kind of fighter to trade on his chin, but I felt like he maybe got a false sense of security um, by relying on his toughness or hiding behind his toughness. And yeah, that was just something I thought was a red flag. It always used to make me wince when the topic of discussion would land on that. Um, and also, I think that he did probably have a bit of a lack of respect for Liam Smith. And I know people like Johnny Nelson, like, no, Eubank Jr. is always in 100% condition. Like, uh, if you looked at how shredded and how he looked in the Liam Smith fight, it shows that he didn't have a lack of respect for Smith. Well, I think that's invalid, because have you ever seen Eubank Jr. out of shape? Regardless of who he's fighting, he's always completely diced and peeled to the bone. I think that's just partly his genetics and partly the fact that he's a bit of a gym rat. But I do think there was some an underlying lack of respect for Liam Smith, because Eubank Jr. is not stupid. He knows what kind of fighter that he prefers. It's typically pressure fighters, guys that close him down, do the hard work for him by coming to him, and so he can just reel off his dozen punch combinations. We've seen that he's always typically struggled with guys who keep it at long range, force him to come forward. And I think Eubank Jr. knew that both subconsciously and consciously. And he thought, you know what, Smith, he's not going to present anything I haven't seen before. When in reality, Smith had plenty that Eubank Jr. hadn't seen before, and plenty that he couldn't deal with. So I think going into this fight now, he knows that Smith can hurt him, and he knows that Smith isn't just any Joe Bloggs pressure fighter who Eubank Jr. can play his usual game with. And so when it comes to formulating a prediction for this one, I've got to admit, I'm having a tough time. My head is telling me that Smith wins again based on the skill, because I was impressed with how Smith approached the fight and how he was gradually getting closer to Eubank Jr. The kind of offense that he was able to land on Eubank Jr. even before the stoppage. However, my gut is telling me that Eubank Jr. will come in sharper, a bit more disciplined, and maybe that's Bomac's influence, because that's another variable which many people have questioned, I think rightfully so, because if we just go off on a tangent, Eubank Jr. has had Bomac in his corner for what, a month? Maybe even less? And yeah, I know there are whispers that they were working before and stuff. Regardless of whether it's 1 month or 2 months, let's say, if we're being generous, 2 months doesn't make that much of a difference when you consider that Eubank Jr. has been a pro for, nearly 12 years? Over a decade. And Eubank Jr. has generally fought the same way a lot of the time. Yeah, he's been with a couple of trainers and there have been some tweaks to his style, but I think Eubank Jr.'s habits are very much ingrained at this point. So how much is Bomac going to be able to add to Eubank Jr.? Personally, I don't think he's going to be able to add much given the time frame. However, I think his influence there may be settling for Eubank Jr. At the same time, I think it might keep Eubank Jr. on a straight and narrow, because just based on the very limited footage I've seen, I think Eubank Jr. is willing to listen to Bomac, given Bomac's status as being the trainer of Terence Crawford, who is largely seen as one of the finest fighters in the entire sport. And when this news broke about this partnership between Bomac and Eubank Jr., I said that Eubank Jr. has always struck me as the kind of guy who is only willing to listen to you if he perceives you as being better than him or having a higher status than himself. And with his trainers of the past, he never really had that. Even with his own dad and Ronnie Davis, he never had that, because he knows who they are. There's no mystique around them necessarily. But then when it came to Roy Jones, one of the greatest fighters of all time, Eubank Jr. couldn't really hold a candle to Roy Jones Jr.'s list of accomplishments. It's night and day. And even Bomac as a trainer, under his guidance, his influence is Terence Crawford, who once again, Eubank Jr.'s not even in the same stratosphere if we're talking about achievement and ability, as Terence Crawford. So I think there will be an influence there, not necessarily stylistically, but from a mental perspective. So I see this fight going longer. I want to say probably points, because even though this fight could end like the first fight, we've seen that Liam Smith has more than enough power, more than enough offensive prowess and skill to get Eubank Jr. out of there. I think both guys are going to be fully aware of what happened in the first fight, particularly Eubank Jr., and he won't be so lackadaisical. He won't be so willing to linger on the ropes and in the corner. I think he's going to be a bit more wired in this fight. And so therefore I see it go longer, most likely to points. A stoppage in this rematch wouldn't surprise me, but I see it going to points just because there's that element of caution. But then, of course, the next part of the prediction is who wins on points. Now, for the longest time, I was saying Liam Smith. I was too impressed with what he did in the first fight. Eubank Jr. didn't look all at the races. Was getting timed from early on, despite having his own success. You know, Liam Smith probably just has a bit too refined a skill set, just too experienced. But as this fight's approaching, I'm thinking, you know, maybe Eubank Jr. just has enough athleticism, and in this fight, he's just a bit more disciplined so that he can stay away and he doesn't worry about showboating or being too relaxed. Like, he has a healthy amount of alertness and caution. And so this is the kind of fight whereby, you know, come Saturday morning, hours before the fight starts, I'm putting out another video saying I changed my prediction. But you know what? As much credit as I give Liam Smith for winning the first fight, something just tells me, just call it instinct, that Eubank Jr. rights the wrong in this rematch and wins on points. Probably a unanimous decision. Call me crazy, feel free to disagree, but I'm just going to go with my instincts here. I'm going to go for a punt and I'm going to say Eubank Jr. wins this one on points over 12. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section. Do you agree, disagree? It's all good. Just leave it down there. And obviously, state your rationale and what you think will be at play in this rematch. That's all from me on this one. As I say, there may be a redux or a redo where I change my prediction, but you know what? I'm going Eubank Jr. on points over 12. Leave your thoughts in the comment section below, and I'll catch you on the next video.